Happy to welcome you all here to the Chamber's Water Forum. The committee has worked extremely hard on this, and I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised and take away lots of great information today. So without any further ado, on behalf of the Chairman of the Board, Alan Lips, we want to turn the program over to your moderator for today, Dave Bernard. Let's give him a hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad that everybody came out today. As Chief Meteorologist for CBS 4 here in South Florida, and as a Miami Beach resident for the past decade or so, I'm intimately knowledgeable of the issue that is facing not only our community, but really coastal communities all across the country. I grew up on the Texas Gulf Coast. I lived in New Orleans before this, and so I know a little bit about the water and how man has to learn to live with it and properly deal with it. I think we're going to have a great panel here today, a great discussion from the science and the politics and everything in between, because in order to get policies implemented, we have to go through the political system in our country, and we're going to see if we can find a way to make that possible. Right now, I'd like to introduce Wayne Pathman. He's chairman of the Government and Business Relations Council and member of the executive board and partner of law firm Pathman Lewis, which is co-sponsoring the event. And he heads the environmental land use and zoning section of the firm, and he's going to give a couple of comments.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. First of all, before I get into what our forum is about, I'd like to just give you a weather report on the heat. They performed really well last night, and they're on their way to hopefully bringing another championship to our baseball. The Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce is the leading business organization here in Miami Beach, and it is the economic engine that drives our community to bring business into our community. As such, we felt it was our goal to bring together community leaders, business leaders, civic leaders, to try to inform you about what is happening with our climate. Our goal through the Government Relations Committee of the Chamber is to present a series of workshops and forums, this one being the first, and hopefully continuing this throughout the year and next year to try to inform the community, to engage the business community, our residents, and our elected officials to start understanding how climate is changing and how it will affect our community. We hope that they will create a plan that will affect change here in our community to create sustainability. Remember, you don't plan to fail, you fail to plan. And we hope to avoid that. There are three areas that we are dealing with today with regards to water. One is rising tide, stormwater, and potable water. All three are of great concern to our community. Some of you here already know what's going on with regards to the stormwater plant or the water treatment plant on Virginia Key. That will be touched on later by one of the panelists. It's a very important issue to understand because that's the most pressing topic because the amount of money that the county is appropriating for this project without taking into consideration sea level rise. Today we will explore how climate will change our community and what effects it will have both short and long term. I am proud to say, however, that our community, the city of Miami Beach, led by one of our commissioners and president of our chamber, Jerry Libbin, has passed a stormwater plan. It's one of the only stormwater plans that has been passed in the Tri-County area. While we have taken the lead, much needs to be done, and today you will hear what we need to do. At this time, I would like to thank the people who worked with me to bring this forum together. My co-chair, Aaron Tandy, Sherry Roberts, and Ceci Velasco of the Chamber and her staff who put this forum together and will be working on the forums in the future. Now I'd like to turn it back over to David to introduce our first panel, and we'll move forward this afternoon with hopefully trying to educate everybody here, and especially those that are not aware of the issues with regards to climate change. And I want to encourage you to ask a lot of questions. It's important that we give you some feedback because it's very hard to get all the panelists that we have here today that are really experts in their fields, and it's the right time to start asking questions. Thank you.
And I'm going to introduce our first panel, and if they would maybe come up and to the dais, that would help. George Gonzalez, he's an associate professor of political science at the University of Miami. He's published numerous books and research articles on air pollution, energy, global warming, and has taught many courses related to environmental policies. John Englander is an oceanographer, consultant, and the author of High Tide on Main Street, Rising Sea Level and the Coming Coastal Crisis, which explains the long-term certainty of sea level rise. Today his firm, the Sea Level Institute, works with corporations, government agencies, and community organizations, advising them on the potential impacts, financial risks, and new opportunities from sea level rise. And Tommy Strowd is the Assistant Executive Director of Operations, Maintenance, and Construction for South Florida Water Management District. He has more than 30 years experience in environmental and water resource engineering, oversees the operation and maintenance for one of the world's largest multi-purpose water management systems. All right, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Gonzalez for his presentation.
Good morning. Normally, as you can see, I'm an associate professor of political science. What I normally, if I'm presenting to a group like this, what I'd be talking about is U.S. global warming policies, U.S. energy policies, because of course, as a political scientist, I look at the social science side of the global warming phenomenon. But here, today, I'm adhering substitution for Hal Wanless, who is head of geological sciences at the University of Miami. He asked me to come in instead. He couldn't be here. He asked me to come in instead and present at least a small part of his research, because what Hal does, Hal Wanless, what Hal does, and he specializes in this sea level rise, and his area of research specifically focuses on the Arctic region, and looking at ice loss in the Arctic region and how that's impacting sea level rise. So again, I'm here presenting some of Professor Wanless's research. Over the 20th century, we've seen an average of 1 inch of sea level rise every decade, every 10 years. Now, most of that has actually been driven by simply the warming of the sea. So water, as it expands, it warms, and that's what drove most of sea level rise, my understanding, during the 20th century. Today, the concern and the thinking surrounding sea level rise and again the concerns concern really the polarized caps, because there are major ice sheets there, and the concern and thinking is that now the melting of these ice caps are contributing substantially, or can and will contribute substantially to sea level rise in the near to medium to long-term future. And so here I have a slide looking at Arctic ice, so Arctic sea ice. So Arctic sea ice, for those of you that may not know, the Arctic Ocean during the wintertime freezes over, and that Arctic ice, that Arctic ocean ice, slowly melts down over the summer, and normally about 50% of that ice would melt down, but we're seeing a substantial shrinkage of Arctic ocean ice. Now, this has no direct bearing on sea level rise, because Arctic ocean ice is in the ocean already, so the melting in and of itself does not contribute to sea level rise. But we'll see, as I point out, talking about Greenland, that's where the real implications for this, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of Arctic ice melting, that's where the real implications are for sea level rise in terms of Greenland ice. So here, again, looking at the slide, according to Professor Peter Waltham of Cambridge University, sea ice volume has dropped by 50% during the last 3 years. Peter believes that summer ice will disappear in the next 3 to 4 years. And so as the Arctic Ocean becomes more and more ice-free, the concern is that it's going to warm up. And we're seeing it warm up, and that it's going to have a detrimental impact on Greenland in particular. And again, this is really where Professor Wanless's research focuses on Greenland. And so we're just comparing particular years. I mean, one point I'll just make is that what we saw in 2012 was an unusual phenomenon in looking at Greenland ice, in that the entirety of the Greenland ice sheet, or almost the entire, 98%, was melting at the surface, right? Normally, you see here in 2005, about 30-40% of it melts at the surface. In 2012, we saw 98% of it melting at the surface. And we don't know if that phenomenon is going to be repeated. The science tells us that did happen back in the late 19th century, and so it happened in 2012. But again, these are the kind of issues that scientists that look at Greenland are thinking about, right? How frequent are these total melting phenomena, total Greenland ice melting phenomena? How often is this going to happen, and how is that going to contribute to ocean volume and, again, subsequently sea level rise? And so when we look at Greenland, what you see is these mulans, and so we're understanding, I mean, one of the issues that scientists will say about Greenland ice is that we really don't know how it behaves, right? We've never really seen it melt, right? So how quickly it'll melt, what rates and what parts will melt. This is subject to some debate amongst scientists. Again, that look at the Greenland ice sheet. Again, that's my understanding. And so one of the issues we're seeing now are these blue lines, where the ice melts through the ice sheet and down to the bottom, and it will melt the ice at the bottom of the Greenland ice sheet. And so again, the concerns are that this is going to accelerate the melting of Greenland ice, and again, substantially contribute to climate change going into the future. And so again, you can see pictures, very dramatic pictures, almost an entire river really, or stream of water melting down to the bottom of Greenland ice, the ice sheet. And so here is an unhealthy picture, if you're going to talk about ice health, is a rather unhealthy picture. So when you see ice crevicing like this in Greenland, what you're seeing is the melting and the water creating these crevices, and again going down to the concern is going down to the bottom and melting the sheet, again from within. And so most disturbing aerial photograph, severely fractured and rapidly melting, right? You see those little pools of blue water. Again, that water heats up, and again, it sort of cuts through the ice. Again, accelerating, Greenland ice. Rapidly accelerating ice melt of Greenland ice sheet by warm sea. So this is another phenomenon. This is a more recent phenomenon that physical scientists are noting, and this is one reason why the predictions with regards to sea level rise and Greenland ice melt have really been off, right? They've been too conservative, because what has been missed and what wasn't factored in, at least again as I understand it, is the warm ocean water current. Right, so people looked at Greenland ice and they thought about Greenland ice and Greenland ice melt simply as a function of ambient temperature, right? What was the temperature of the air going to be? What's the rate of melt? And just considering that variable, again, it didn't capture it, because again, it was melting faster than that reasoning would lead us to believe. And so now we understand that what's going on is you're getting more warm ocean water being pumped up to the Arctic. And this is also what's contributing to the very substantial decline in terms of Arctic ocean ice. And so again, Hal puts on this, these are all Hal slides. And so you see, 1.5 feet or much greater per century rise. Right? That's a concern, that you're going to see a relatively rapid melting of Greenland ice. And again, this is decades, century, and again, you're going to see some substantial sea level rise from the Greenland ice sheet. Warm North Atlantic Ocean water moving up the east side of Greenland through 2007, then up the west side after. This warm ocean water is moving into the fjords of outlet glaciers and powerfully accelerating melt far into the Greenland ice sheet. Jacob Shippen ice fjord is at the arrow. So what you see there is the melting, that arrow, the melting that is how it's going deep into the ice sheet. Are you seeing melting deeper and deeper into the core of the ice sheet, right? That's what Hal's pointing out there. The warm Atlantic Ocean has worked its way up along both coasts of Greenland. So here, again, you see a picture of warm water, right, surging up around the Greenland ice sheet, again, surging up into the Arctic Ocean. And again, this is what's seemingly driving, if you will, the collapse of Arctic Ocean ice. And the concern is, again, that this is going to profoundly affect the Greenland ice sheet. Now, to what extent, again, we don't know. I mean, one thing, again, I may have already said this, but I think it bears repeating. At what rate are we going to see Greenland ice melt? Again, this is the subject of a lot of speculation and disagreement, and not even in more research, right? In terms of looking at the future, in terms of the Greenland ice melting and sea level rise. So here again, I'm just presenting Hal's slides. He gives some projections here where he points out, again, one prediction is between 2018 and 2024, we'll see about a half foot of sea level rise. Again, and what does that look like, right? You compare it to the current topography versus, what half a foot would look like, how much land will be lost, and not much appears to disappear from this picture. 1 foot of sea level rise, again, 2031 to 2042, 2 feet of sea level rise, 2048 to 2066. And of course, it's also important that here we're talking not simply about land loss, which of course is very critical and very important, but we're also talking about potable water, the ability to keep out sea level intrusion, right, if you will, from the land. So, I mean, there's a lot of variables here and a lot of factors. When we talk about the sea level rise, it's not simply land loss, but again, potable water, fresh water, and the ability to keep out salt water from intruding, if you will, into the under the land here in South Florida, because it's so flat and all that. 3 feet of sea level rise, 2063, 2058. Here we see some much more substantial. We see some much more substantial land loss. 4 feet of sea level rise, 74 to 2100. I don't know how much of, I mean, that's most of Miami Beach there is underwater, right? Even 3 feet of sea level rise has a very substantial dramatic impact. Right, so once you start to get beyond 2 feet of sea level rise, 4 feet of sea level rise, again, very substantial, very dramatic impacts on Miami Beach. And again, the question of potable water and the ability to live on these narrowing slivers of land, right, become a very serious question. With that said, thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to receiving your questions later.
Thank you. I think my talk, I couldn't see George's slides, unfortunately, so we were a bit of a disadvantage. I don't know exactly what images you've seen, but I know that Hal Wong was who you referred to, and by the way, John Leary was a colleague of Hal's in the geology department at the University of Miami, and I are very consistent in kind of our overall read. What I'm going to do with you, how do I, okay, here we go. Is step back a bit, and while George talked about the uncertainties and things we don't know for sure when you look at very specific amounts, I'm going to step back a little bit and try and show you what we do know for sure and let you see a bigger picture that hopefully will guide us as, guide you in your community. I live in Boca Raton, by the way, not too far away, but just South Florida, but not the Miami Beach community, which is what's here, and I really appreciate the opportunity by the Chamber of Commerce to think about what does it mean for Miami Beach and how do you adapt. We all know what storm surge does. This was a photograph from Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm. It was only a storm when it went up the coast of Florida. But it began to alert people to what can happen, of course, by the time it hit New York and New Jersey. It was a major event. I got really involved in that because by a strange timing, I published my book that week. In fact, it was Monday of that week as the storm was just offshore here. And a week later, when it had hit New Jersey and New York, I suddenly realized that I had described exactly that scenario in the book on page 121. So I got on television and a few things by just kind of eerie timing. And as usual, with due respect to David, the TV commentator who had me on TV missed the question. He wasn't a meteorologist, but he was a commentator on morning TV, and he said, "So, Mr. Englander, how did you predict this week before it happened?" And I said, the truth is I didn't predict it. I described a number of scenarios that could happen that would surprise people. And the fact that it came out of the script of my book as if I wrote it was as bizarre to me as anybody. But what I want to do with you is quickly take you through a few points, some of which George has covered very well, and I'm going to get to look through them and talk to you more about the backside of this, of the adaptation issues. I want you to come away with 3 points. That the damage to the coast is a combination of 3 things that are very different. 1 is sea level rise, which we're here to talk about. 2 is extreme tides, and 3 is storm surge. And it's the confluence, or the way those 3 things combine, that affect things. But they're very different, because the important thing about sea level rise is it lasts for centuries, if not thousands of years. So it's a very different time scale than storm surge or tides, which happens every day, and then lunar tides, more extreme, once a month, and so on. So to start to distinguish those 3 different factors is really important as we look ahead to the coming decades. And then, while this is an alarming situation for South Florida because of our porous limestone and the inability of a simple seawall to keep water out, which we can talk about later, but the good news, if we're to find a silver lining to this cloud, or no pun, the glass half full, rather than the glass half empty about this severe problem, is that it's a slow emergency. And compared to most problems, like an approaching Category 4 hurricane, or tornadoes that other parts of the country have to face with, or tsunamis, things that give us little of any warning, the good news about sea level rise is when you step back and look at the big picture, while we may not know what decade it's going to happen by, we can plan. And that's a blessing. We need to take advantage of that. As I think George probably alluded to, again, I was in the dark during his presentation, but Florida has changed shape dramatically. If you look back 120,000 years ago, when sea level was about 25 feet higher than today at the previous warm point, a little warmer than today, this state was very small. If you go to the peak of the last ice age, just 18,000 years ago, Florida was 100 miles wider because the sea level was 390 feet lower. And then, of course, we get to today. So the point is that while we think Florida has a shape and will stay there forever, when we look back geologically, we find out that it's changed. And in fact, it makes sense when you look at since the last glacial period, those 18,000 years, sea level has risen, again, 390 feet. And two takeaways from this slide. One is it's not a smooth linear curve. In fact, there's a big step there in the middle when sea level rose 65 feet in 4 centuries. That's 1.5 foot a decade for 40 decades. And that's by nature, without any impact on that. But the other interesting takeaway is that sea level got to pretty much the current level about 6,000 years ago. And that's about when we began keeping written records. So no wonder we think sea level's always going to be there, but it's not. And if you have kids or grandkids, you probably saw this 4-part documentary series maybe as many times as I had to watch it. I have a 12-year-old daughter. This was part 2 of the Ice Age series, The Meltdown, but it helps to visualize that behind the animals is 2 miles of ice. Not exactly accurate as would have appeared, but enough to remind us that 10,000 feet of vertical ice, which came down across the northern hemisphere, as it melted, it raised sea level by almost 400 feet. Makes sense. If we look back over 1 million years of sea level history, we see periodic ups and downs of sea level, 300 or 400 feet, a regular pattern by nature. And interestingly, if we look at the blow-up of the most recent 140,000 years, we can see something very interesting, that the 100,000-year approximate natural cycle of ice ages is an 80-20 split, roughly. So sea level drops for about 80,000 years and rises for 20,000 years. Again, round figures, make it easier to remember. And we're at the top of that curve. We should have been entering the downside now, 80,000 years toward the next ice age. But because of burning all the fossil fuels, we've solved that problem. We're not going to be facing another ice age in 80,000 years, so you don't need to worry about that. You can put away your winter coats. But seriously, we do have a problem because it's warming, and we've broken the cycle. We've changed the natural cycle. Sea level's rising, 7 or 8 inches global average for this century. Here's an interesting correlation. On the bottom is sea level rise for 420,000 years, left to right. Again, the same pattern we just saw, essentially, ups and downs every 100,000 years. Temperature, global average, right above it in red. It correlates, and so does the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide at the top. But as you'll note in the far upper right, circled in red, is the problem. That little vertical tail in the far upper right, can you see that on the screen? That's the recent record we broke, 400 parts per million. We got CO2 out of the 180 to 280 range of the last 5 million years. And it's now at 400 and climbing. And that's the problem. The question is how quickly the lower 2 curves will follow. They are following. We don't know how quickly it'll happen. We're running the experiment now to see how quickly we can melt the ice sheets. How do we know that? Well, fortunately, nature preserved a great set of air samples for us. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are compacted in layers, snow to ice to pressurized ice, and those little bright spots in the lower right are air bubbles. And we can actually go in and measure the amounts of CO2 and measure 2 different isotopes of oxygen and get a proxy for temperature. So amazingly, in Greenland we have 420,000 years of temperature and CO2 records, and in Antarctica we have 800,000. In deep sea sediments we can go back even further. As George covered, the melting Arctic ice cap does not relate to sea level rise. It's floating sea ice. There's a submarine at the North Pole with a local inhabitant, but you can see it's thin sea ice. And as floating ice melts, it doesn't change the level of liquid in the glass. Sea level will rise as the 2 big ice sheets, again, George talked about Greenland and Antarctica. You can visualize them easily here in this Google Earth image. And here's a shot I took in Greenland in 2007, just to help visualize where the icebergs calve off from the glacier. But if we travel up the glacier by helicopter and get to the top of the ice sheet, there's only 2 big ice sheets in the world, by the way. One's on Greenland and one's in Antarctica. The rest are glaciers. There's about 170,000 identified glaciers in the world. But as we go up to the top of the ice sheet, we see where the ice is actually melting and gathering in rivulets into streams, into those big streams that I think George showed, and where they go down to the base of the ice sheet. And and that's what's adding to sea level rise, and Greenland is melting faster and faster and faster every year. Antarctica is different. This shot was taken the year before, in 2006 when I was there. Just to help you visualize, Antarctica is a bit different. It looks just a white blob on the map, but it's big mountains and a lot more ice, 7 times more ice in aggregate. People talk about Antarctica getting bigger and disproving global warming. The opposite is the truth. While East Antarctica is getting bigger, and West Antarctica is getting smaller and warming quicker and becoming destabilized. To visualize this using a Miami icon, if we are presently at the 30th floor of sea level, just 20,000 years ago, 18,000 years ago, was down at the ground floor at street level. When all the ice sheets melt again, hasn't happened for 30 million years, but it'll happen faster than that. When all the ice sheets melt again, we'll get another 17 floors of sea level rise. And not to scare you, that's not going to happen this century. It's not going to happen next century. It's not going to happen the century after that. But it should help you understand that this is a process of inevitability and timing. And we can plan what we're going to do this century, and this decade, and this year. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick. The projections, again, George referred to them, are pretty much from a foot or so in the next 50 years, by the end of the century, anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 feet, depending upon how much we warm, where our fuel sources are. We're not doing too good in sea level projections. This is to show you the different projections that have been done by the big intergovernmental panel on climate change over the last 20 years. Those are their projections. This is the actual sea level rise. It's the top range of the projections. That should not be. What it proves is, even as recently as 20 years ago, we lowballed sea level rise projections. So when people say scientists are exaggerating, the opposite is the truth. Sea level, storm surge, and tides all combine in terms of how far back they're going to push us. Effects will be different worldwide. This is just a simple bar graph depiction from 46 inches down to 4 inches for the same last century, depending on where you are. Sea level rise is not consistent. For some technical reasons, I don't have time today to get into that, but just to say to you, you have to look at places individually and properties individually, which is something I help people do. Look at portfolios, look at properties, whether it be from the Bahamas to the Pacific, to the Indian Ocean. Places are different geologically, in terms of sea level effects, and you need to look at things in particular. But the second takeaway point is that this is inevitable. We have passed the point of no return in terms of sea level rising. If we stop all carbon emissions today, not one more drop of fossil fuel is burned, sea level will rise. It will happen more slowly. And we should try and slow it. But it gets us to a surprising reality. We need to begin adapting to sea level rise and its effect on the shoreline. And the sooner we do, the better we'll plan. So we need to assess vulnerabilities. That's what I try and help people do. We need to begin building higher, setting back, better engineering, and also slow the rise as much as we can. Here's my final shot from Netherlands. We have a representative from the Netherlands here. I was there 2 weeks ago, giving a presentation and meeting with the Dutch experts who probably have the biggest history, 1,000 years of dealing with sea level or storm surge threats. And this is the town of Vlissingen. And it's a great example of how you can adapt to sea level rise. There's a large built-up berm. The roadway's on top of it. At street level, the newer buildings are even raised further, and the ground floor of 7 meters, 15 feet, is designed so that storm surge can flow through the building, like the buildings in the Florida Keys that have everything up to story. So there are ways to design around it or to it. The challenge is that our porous limestone is different than their clay soil, so we need to do it a little bit differently. There's a lot more information if you want. Obviously, my book's available, both at Books and Books. I have a few copies here. There's also, I have a free website, and there's a seminar that Daniel's going to talk to you about in Fort Lauderdale in a month that I'm going to be giving a full presentation and Q&A. So thank you very much.
Hey Dave, good morning everybody. My name is Tommy Strowd, Assistant Executive Director of the South Florida Water Management District. My responsibility is for the operation and maintenance of the regional canal systems that provide flow protection and water supply for the coast of South Florida. And I'm going to talk to you about the challenge we have in managing flood risk and droughts now, but also the implications of the challenges that will have in the future relative to sea level rise. Just a little bit of background, we're one of 5 water management districts that were created by the Florida legislature in 1972. Our history goes back, however, to the late 1940s. We were created to manage and operate the Central and Southern Florida project for flood control and other purposes as a federal project constructed by the Corps of Engineers between 1950 and 1970. And it's designed for multiple purposes. It balances flood control, water supply, navigation interest, as well as protection of saltwater intrusion of the aquifer, and protection of fish and wildlife. And we operate today in accordance with the criteria which developed by the Corps of Engineers for that system. Just to give you some statistics, it's about 2,700 miles of canal that stretch all the way just south of Disney World to Florida City. We provide water for water supply even down into the Florida Keys and Miami Beach. I have 116 drainage basins, around 1,300 water control structures. The graphic you see here, you can see my pointer. Right here is one of those water control structures in the Kissimmee Valley. We have almost 70 stormwater pumping stations. The photograph right below that is one of those in West Palm Beach. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the water that could be moved with those 70 pump stations, if we could point them all in one direction and turn them on at the same time, it fill up a container the size of the Dolphin Stadium in about 4 minutes. And of course, that's distributed over 16 counties from Orlando to Miami-Dade County, so we don't have that much of an effect on the system in general, but just give you a sense of magnitude. Lake Okeechobee, one of the largest lakes in the country, 750 square miles, is actually a water storage area for South Florida, as well as water conservation areas which were part of the remnant Everglades. And this graphic here kind of shows that transition of historic flow from, on the left-hand side, the way the natural system flows through the Kissimmee River and Lake Okeechobee and down over the Florida Everglades, and how the project that was constructed by the Corps of Engineers in the 60s and 70s altered that flow. It's pretty significant. Now, it has significant, if not serious, impacts to the existing ecosystem, particularly Florida Everglades and Florida Bay, but it's the reason that we can exist here. It's the reason that there is water for us to drink and for flood protection for all the homes and communities for 7 million people that are there today. And this is sort of a photographic representation. The graphic on the right is an actual satellite image today of South Florida. This is a rendering of what we think it may have looked like 100 years ago, and you can see the natural Everglades flowing down into Florida Bay. And today there's only about half of that left. And this area of white and gray on the right-hand side are the urbanized areas in Palm Beach, Broward, and Martin, in Miami-Dade County. So how we manage the balance and what are the implications of sea level rise? You've seen this graphic before. This is a graphic developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're our federal partner in water management in South Florida, so we utilize that expertise. However, there are a couple of points that have to be made. One is you can see the sort of extrapolation of the past history of sea level rise, and I think everybody here recognizes that is way underestimated. In fact, these current estimates are probably even on the low side, as Dr. Engler mentioned earlier. So what are the implications? There are areas of South Florida that lie anywhere from 3 to 6 feet above sea level. Miami Beach was a good example of that. And sea level's risen about 7 inches over the past 100 years, and the primary impact on our infrastructure is that we rely on gravity to move water out of our canal systems to tide. And that's the way we move water out when it's raining, like today. And we also utilize it to move water to different places for water supply. As sea level rises, that pressure that we have available to move water through our system diminishes. So it's going to be more difficult for us to move water out during flood times. And it's going to be a challenge for us to maintain the quality of the water, potable water, as salinity increases inland. So pump systems may be a solution, but they won't work everywhere, and there are limits to those. And areas that are downstream of our system, I'm going to show you a photograph of that in a minute, are difficult to manage. I don't know what that is. Just hit the X and pick it up. It did. All right, let me just go ahead. Under South Florida is a large limestone geologic formation, and rainfall seeps into that and creates the fresh water that we all utilize today to drink. Salt water on the coast, Miami Beach is a good example, is denser, and therefore it has a tendency to push inland, underground, and potentially contaminate that underground aquifer. As As sea level rises, that pressure is just going to get greater. So we have a series of water control structures that manage our canal system at a higher level so that we can preclude that inward migration of salt water into the underlying aquifers. We have about 40 of these water control structures in South Florida. Unfortunately, they're miles west of here. They don't have a direct impact on Miami Beach except for the provision of fresh water that is piped here and utilized in our consumption. So one of the big challenges is, as sea level rises, maintaining the location of that saltwater pond. As it tends to move inland, if it moves into a well field, that well field is then permanently compromised. And from that point forward, we'll have to look for new sources of water for fresh water. I also mentioned that we utilize a system for flood protection. About 10 years ago, many of you in Miami may remember, there were two storms, back-to-back as far as years ago. One in 1999, Hurricane Irene. There was one in 2000, a no-name storm. And both of those flooded Miami-Dade County seriously. And at the height of each of those storms, the sea level had risen to a point that it was higher than the water level in our canals. And we had to close our gates in order to prevent salt water from coming into the canal, exacerbating flooding and contaminating the aquifer. Of course, you can imagine a major flood event. We're very popular closing gates that were relied on for flood protection. After that event, we worked real closely with Miami-Dade County, Miami-Dade County and local interests. There's a picture of some of these water control structures. But here's the pump station I'm talking about. We evaluated the need to put in a pumping station so that regardless of the water level on the ocean side, we could push the water out with pumps and continue to provide flood protection. Now, we didn't realize at the time the implications that might have on future sea level rise. So I'm not going to stand here and say we had some forward-thinking vision of sea level rise and we've already started to accommodate it. But in hindsight, we look back and say these types of facilities are the types of facilities that we're going to probably rely on to ensure flood protection can be maintained in the face of increasing sea level rise. We continue to help local communities like Miami Beach. We participate in the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. These two documents are available on our website, sfwmd.gov. We look at the trends of sea level rise and climate change in water management. And again, our focus is regional water management. We provide water supply and flood protection for farms in Osceola County, areas around Naples, Lee County, Martin County, the Florida Everglades, and areas all throughout South Florida. But it's regional, and all those will be affected to some degree. But our job is to balance those competing interests. The fact that we provide flood protection in an urban area has an implication on water supply, water quality, and vice versa. So when we look at the implications of sea level rise, just the last thing I'll leave you with, in the face of changing environment, long-range planning is critical. And as an element of that, it has to be considered to be adaptable. Adaptive management is one of the cornerstones of Everglades restoration. We realized that in 1949, when engineers with slide rules and graph paper sat down and tried to figure out how we're going to form South Florida with the population that lives here today, there were some things that they didn't think about. Water quality, the ecological condition of the Everglades, and of course sea level rise was not something anybody discussed at those times. But today we recognize that we're going to change this system to try to make it better. We have to make it adaptable. And I think that is true for any stormwater planning system that we have in the future. We've got time, as Dr. England mentioned, but we need to start now. And with that, I'm glad to answer your questions.
I'm going to take just a second. We're going to have questions at the end after our second panel, but I was going to address a couple of questions here to the panelists. And I guess one thing, Mr. Gonzalez, I think a lot of people here are interested in is obviously to adapt some of this science that we have learned, it has to go through a political process. And obviously when we talk about climate change, for better or for worse, it has taken on a political tone. How do you see the best way to maneuver this issue through the political system in a way that can reach at least some kind of compromise, but at the same time advance what we all want to do is adapt to the changing realities along the coastline?
Well, I guess you're asking me to put on my political science cap.
Yes, yes.
You know, just by way of, again, some speculation, because we're left with in terms of what would it take for the global warming issue to gain traction politically in the U.S.? And I think it would be, and indeed it should be conceptualized this way, is to start to look at global warming as a security issue. Start to look at global warming as a way to defend land, to defend territory, to defend populaces. So, you know, just like we consider a lot of other issues as security matters, global warming should be conceptualized as a security issue. Food security, especially food security, security in terms of clean water, and you know, that's the way that if global warming is going to gain major traction in our political system in the U.S., I think that's the way it's going to happen.
Mr. Engler, Mr. Strowd, do you have a comment along those lines?
I think George's point is valid. But I think what I've found is that setting aside the complexity and politicization of climate change can be done by just looking at the shoreline, what you're talking about here today. And the shoreline, as you know, David, encompasses both the storm surge, which is kind of a predictable, or not predictable in terms of time frame, but a manageable height we're familiar with, and then when it hits at extreme tides like Sandy did up north. And then how does that interface with sea level rise becomes a very different story. Because as it destroys property, either permanently like sea level rise or temporarily like a storm surge, it gets people to think in terms of real economic terms. Kind of coming back to George's term, but it's a very specific lens through which to look at climate change. And I find that's helpful because it's economic, it's where we live, it's where we do business, where our communities are. And it takes it out of the theoretical.
And Mr. Strowd, I was going to ask you, one thing that I was talking about with Mr. Englander beforehand is that I think we have two issues when we talk about this from the meteorology aspect that I'm familiar with, the day-to-day nature of weather, hurricanes, flooding that we have here from severe storms, and then the longer range climate issue. And the shorter range I look at is mitigation. You know, what are we doing to mitigate against what we've known has happened? We know we've had hurricanes bigger and stronger in many in the past than maybe we've had in recent many, and we know those are going to come back. You know, we are aware of the types of flooding that we can see, coastal flooding, freshwater, rain flooding, and those are going to happen. Are we taking the proper precautions just for that? Because the second phase is adapting to what we haven't experienced before, along with Mr. Englander was said. So are you satisfied where we are? You touched on that a little bit in your talk, but I'll let you expand.
No, I think, you know, one of those challenges that we have at the Water Management District is recognizing that this was designed by people essentially in the 1940s and 50s. And they had certain assumptions about the number of people that were going to be living in South Florida, the land uses associated with that, and where people were going to be living. And we look back and there were some of them that were just not exactly accurate. And not because they didn't have good knowledge, they just didn't expect the growth to occur where it did and when it did. So we're trying to maintain levels of service associated with just those differences in growth pattern. And I think now you add on to that the implications of sea level rise, and it really focuses the need for the political system and agencies of every level, local, state, and federal, to reevaluate those on a case-by-case basis. Every community is going to have a different set of circumstances that are going to need to be addressed. It's going to take, I think, a bottom-up approach to make that, to bring to the awareness of higher level governmental agencies.
And Mr. Engler, maybe this is something you could just briefly clear up, and I don't know if anything can be briefly cleared up on this topic, but regardless, everyone out there, myself included, have read many papers. You know, we read articles in the New York Times, we read, you know, we see documentaries, and we see all these varying estimates on sea level rise. And I think that makes it difficult for people to believe that it's something that actually occurs as a reality. Where in one sentence, you might say, well, we could see sea level rise of 6 to 8 inches over 100 years, and on the other side, you see 6, 8, 10 feet. Obviously, there's a huge difference. People can conceptualize 10 feet, not 6 inches, and maybe what the consequences of both are. Why do we see that disparity sometimes?
It's a great question, and I was in a discussion with people from the National Climate Assessment this morning about how that's characterized, and it's understandable to be confused for the public. 8 inches is no longer realistic for this century, and you'll still see it in print. It has to do with the misrepresentation in the last MBCC report, etc. I think all of us, John and so on, would agree, just set that one aside, even though you're going to see it in print. It's not possible to assume that Greenland melt rate will not accelerate for the rest of the century. There's no reason to say that given that the oceans are warmer, okay? The more current estimates are 1 to 4 feet, and some people would say it's more like 3, and in extreme cases would be 6 feet. But even that doesn't fully account for the worst cases that can happen, such as the methane releases that are starting to happen and Antarctica, the Western Antarctica destabilizing, okay? So I tell people this century, plan on 2 to 5 feet. It could be worse. We will have advance notice of that. But let's start thinking in the 3-foot range, because it's going to challenge our engineering and our architecture, our community planning, etc., and make us get real about it. So I would summarize it that way.
All right, well, I'd like to thank the panelists. Give them a big hand.
Good afternoon. I think what we're going to do, thank you for keeping your seats, is we're going to transition ahead. Having just had the challenges laid out by our first panel, we want to now turn our attention towards discussing how ideas to address these issues can be formulated and, more importantly, implemented in our community. Towards that end, my co-chairs, Sherry and Wayne, and I appreciate that in the audience today are government representatives, business leaders, elected officials, and community leaders, because what you're going to hear from our distinguished panelists next is that it's going to take a coalition of these people who have practical, knowledgeable, and innovative ideas to work together at the local, county, and statewide level in order to explore ideas that will creatively fit our community. Because what you're going to hear is that there are solutions out there. Some of those solutions work in other places. Some of those solutions might work here. But what we're going to need is a community will to bring all of those ideas to the table, identify the ideas that really work, and then, more harder slog, implement those ideas through a collaborative process that brings business leaders, government officials, and community activists together to address this critical issue. If I leave you with one thing, I think the panel, the first panel, and even the second panel is going to tell you that it's time to act. We have time, but it's time to act. It's time for everybody here to become educated and to be engaged. On behalf of my co-chairs, Wayne and Sherry, thank you for your attendance and your attention. David, I turn it back to you.
Okay, now we'd like our second panel to come forward. We have Esther Van Geloven. I told her I was going to mess that up. I even messed up the English version. She gave me the Dutch version. I wasn't even going to try that. Katie Sorenson, Daniel Krieger, and Wayne Patton. I'd like to say a few words about each one. Esther is the Senior Commercial Officer at the Netherlands Consulate General. The Netherlands has special relevance to the United States in the fields of water management, energy, and climate. The U.S. has turned to the Netherlands as its go-to ally to help address some of its own unique water challenges like flooding and drought in the western U.S., hurricane protection along the Gulf Coast, and rising sea levels that threaten major cities and small communities. Given that large areas of the Netherlands are below sea level and prone to flooding, the Dutch have unique expertise in living with and managing with these issues. Katie Sorenson is President and CEO of the Good Government Initiative at the University of Miami, a program educating elected officials at the state and local level in the important issues of government. She served on the Miami-Dade County Commission for 16 years, was vice chair of the commission from 2002 to 2004, and was also on the executive committee of the South Florida Regional Planning Council, and has been an outspoken advocate for environmental and infrastructural issues. Daniel Krieger is co-founder and executive director of the Association of Climate Change Officers. He has vast experience establishing partnerships and collaborating with federal agencies, environmental nonprofits, academic institutions, and multinational corporations. He has a unique familiarity of key climate and sustainability leaders in private and public sectors. And of course, we have Wayne Patton, the partner with the Miami law firm Pathman Lewis, which is co-sponsoring the event, and he heads the environmental land use and zoning sections of the firm. He's a member of Florida Bar's litigation and environmental law sections. He's also the current chair of the Government and Business Relations Council at the Chamber. Now we're going to turn it over to Esther, who is going to give us a fascinating discussion of exactly how the Dutch have done it for all these years. Esther.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just going to tell a few short things about the Netherlands, just so to put it in perspective. As you can see, it's a very small country in Europe. We're on the ocean, just like here. We are just twice the size of New Jersey, so we're a tiny country. 17 million people. We're the third most densely populated country, the third largest investor in the United States. But what is more important, 60% of our population lives in, and 70% of our GDP is earned in areas below sea level. So for us, storm surge, sea level rise, etc., is of utmost importance. And for centuries, we've been fighting against water. Now we're trying to work with the water and dealing with nature to make sure that our 70% of our GDP is safe and that our businesses can continue to do business in these areas. Some people have asked us in the past, what are you going to do? Are you going to see if you can live with the water, or should you just move to Germany? Which would be an option, but we prefer to stay in our country. So we have to be proactive. If we're not proactive, it's a matter of national survival. So, and we see water as an opportunity. Here is a slide of Rotterdam. You can see the water challenges, which are very similar to here. We have the precipitation, which basically we see an increase in that, in combination with what was mentioned before as well by Dr. Englander, sea level rise, groundwater, and river discharges. All of these combined, we get certain challenges, which you see here as well. Okay, our challenges in context. We have the discharges that I just told you about, the sea level rise. One of the most important things is spatial developments. We also have had a tendency to build things close by to the water because you want to enjoy the view. You want to be able to do business there as well. Our beaches are just as important there as they are here. Our port is of vital importance. Rotterdam is the largest port in Europe, so they need to adapt as well. So the port, for instance, in Rotterdam has just built a whole new section, and what we do is something called no regrets measurements. We plan developments like this, not only taking into account storm surge, for instance, or the rising of the river, but also sea level rise. It basically is not going to hurt anything. We're going to build there anyway, so we might as well adapt now and not have to look back 100 years later and say like, oh, what if? Urban sprawl, of course, is a major issue, so that is something that we take into account as well. So what have we done? Most people know the Netherlands with all our structures, our hard measures as we call it, the dikes, but also, as you can see, storm surge barriers that have been built in the river to make sure that our harbor in Rotterdam is safe. But in the last few years, we have started to build with nature more and look at soft measures. As you can see here, this is an adaptation toolkit where we have divided the different measures that we are taking for region, city, but also street level and building level to see like, okay, what do we have to do? What prevention do we need? What are the reducing effects and what is the recovery? You can see the installation of pumps. That's one part that you can do. There's a lot of other things. There's a lot of innovative and creative ideas like the green roofs, which is one of the things, okay, when we have more precipitation, see if you can have it somewhere else than on the roads, blocking people from driving there. This was already, well, this is a different picture though, because this is somewhere else. Integration in urban development. This is a boulevard that is in a very busy beach resort called Scheveningen, close by to The Hague, where the dike is built into the boulevard. That area could use some sprucing up to begin with, so this was a perfect opportunity for us to see like, okay, how can we build something here that will look aesthetically nice and pretty, but also have a very important function, and that is to protect the area that is right behind it. If you see the complete, you can't see the completed product here, but it flows very nicely to the beach. So the sand and the actual dike or the boulevard have the same color right now, and after that's where you get the road and the bicycle path and the hotels that are there, et cetera, et cetera. So it looks, the people around there and also the tourists that come there now are very happy with this new development. Another way of building with nature and already taking into account sea level rise and storm surge is building with nature in terms of let the nature do the work for you. We have an issue with beach renourishment, which you have here as well. Because of sea level rise, we see that our beaches are getting smaller. So there is a pilot right now, which is called the Sand Motor, where they have created a peninsula just made of sand that slowly, because of the waves and the winds, takes the sand to the beaches. So we don't have to do anything. It just slowly goes there. Right now it's a nature preserve. There's a lot of birds there and everything like that. It's a recreational area as well, so it looks very nice. So this is one of the ways that the Dutch are trying to see how can we do things differently. In some cases, like I said, this is a pilot. So we're trying to see what effect will it have. And it actually is doing what they predicted what it would do. It goes a little faster than we predicted. But if we're not doing anything, you know, we will have to move to Germany, which is not what we want. So there's a lot of other examples that I can give you, especially with spatial planning. Whenever something is torn down right now, if there's a parking garage that is being built, we're looking, can we just build a parking garage or can we do it differently? So for instance, in Rotterdam, there's a parking garage that has water storage underneath it. So we can store it there when need be. There's water squares, which are beautiful looking squares that normally are just for recreation. There are benches there, there are trees, etc., etc. But if, in case need be, we will let it flood instead of having houses flood or businesses flood. So those are just a few of the examples that I'd like to give you. I have more, but we'll do that at the questions and the answers and move on to the panel, I guess. Thank you.
I think also just at this time I thought it'd be a good idea if we allow Katie and Daniel just to make a little statement, a couple of minutes, just on their perspective and how they've been working on this issue. Katie?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking out at all of you and trying to figure out who some of you are. Because, you know, we have some elected officials here, and I really want to thank the elected officials who are present. Would you all stand? Because I really want to recognize the elected officials who are here. Either members of a former Good Government Initiative cohort or a future one. So Kelly Reed from Bay Harbor Islands and Myra Kutson is here, and from Palm Beach County, and I'm blanking, Myra, on the name of your... Palm Beach Shores. Thank you, Palm Beach Shores, and Daniel Deitch is a member of our inaugural class, and he's the mayor of Surfside. So I'm really glad to see elected officials. Marcia Montserrat is here from Miami Beach, and she was the assistant to Kristen Jacobs, and Kristen Jacobs is really, I think, the great leader of this region. Is here from a government entity. Would you please raise your hands? Stand up. Okay, yeah, stand up. And Nicole is very important as well. Nicole Hefty with the county. And I just recognize Jerry Libbin, Commissioner of Miami Beach, who does double duty with the Chamber of Commerce as well. So Jerry is a very important and pivotal person in this. Then who's here from the business community? Would you raise your hands if you're here from the business community? Okay, great. And then and I also want to recognize Caroline Lewis, who's really my mentor from the Clio Institute. She's done a wonderful job. And so who's here from the educational, university community, educational people on this issue? All right, great. It's really important that you know who each other is, because this is really a team effort, and I view this as a major community organizing project. Is there anybody who this topic is new to today? Anyone? Okay, or you're not admitting it. Okay, Dennis, it's new to Dennis. Thank you, Dennis, for being a leader in this area and recognizing your newness. So everybody's heard a little bit about this, or a lot about it, or else you're really steeped in it. But for the greater part of this community, that's just not the case. And I see so much apathy and so much lack of awareness on this issue, and really very little knowledge. So I just wanted to put that kind of in context before we started the rest of our discussion. Dan?
Thanks, Katie. So I bring a little bit of a different perspective. I don't hold public office. I don't know if I aspire to at this point, but I grew up on Miami Beach. My parents owned the same house from 1972 until 2 years ago. And I run a national organization that's based in DC, and 2.5 years ago my wife decided that she wasn't doing winter anymore, and I'm back in South Florida. Since I got back down here, I've discovered an exceptional community of leaders, many of whom just stood up, and Katie referenced the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. The work that they're doing really is groundbreaking, and yet it needs extraordinary support. Last year when Sandy was pummeling the Northeast, what most people don't realize is that Miami Beach and significant chunks of Miami Beach were sitting under a foot of water. In particular, I was having dinner at Joe's Stone Crabs that night, and driving up to where MacArthur Causeway dumps off onto 5th and Alton was literally a foot of water. It went above the wheel well of my car, and I didn't think I was actually going to make it through that without the car dying. It didn't rain that day. It didn't rain that week. That was just sea level rise and king tides. And that's the context and the conversation I think we really need to be having. 2 years ago, while on a work trip, my parents, while they were still in their house, were watching my dog for me. And when I went to pick up the dog, all of North Bay Road from 19th to 23rd Street or 27th Street was underwater. And I asked them if it had rained a ton that week while I was gone, and my mom said, no, just full moon, high tide. And I said, Mom, when I was younger, we've been in this house for 39 years, and I'm not that old yet, but close to it. And I said, I don't remember ever seeing sitting water other than when tropical storms came through. Did this happen when I was younger? And she said, no. I said, well, this is what your son does for a living. This is only one of two things that can be happening here. Either we're sinking or the sea level's rising. Neither one of them is particularly a great outcome, but it's one that we have to address. And so I'm trying to look at this in the context of the national perspective that I have, and then the home one. And before we part ways, I do want to give you one thing to think about as you hear examples of things that are going on around the country and things that we can be doing as a community. Is we're learning from the Dutch, who have been exceptional leaders for decades on this. And I commented at a workshop that FIU hosted on Miami Beach a couple months ago on this topic, and said, why would we not position the city of Miami Beach, tourist capital of the country, to have the same sort of ecotourism, where people 30 years from now, instead of thinking about where in the US they could go to learn about how to adapt to this issue, they would come to us. Is that not the economic engine for this community? And oh, by the way, it would also help us become resilient to that. So I hope that you guys will think about this as an opportunity as well as a challenge.
Okay, well let's expand on the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, because that really has been a huge initiative that's gone forward. And Katie and Dan, I'd like you to expand just a little bit about exactly what that is supposed to accomplish and maybe what that's accomplished so far.
Okay, again, I want to really thank Kristen Jacobs, who isn't here, but the commissioner from Broward County, who's now the mayor of Broward County, who was really the visionary, I think, who got this whole thing started. And it was a collaboration for 4 counties, Monroe, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Broward. And the commitments included things like policy collaboration, developing regional tools, including a unified sea level rise projection, inundation maps, greenhouse gas emissions baseline, all those things so that we could all agree on what was going on. And then creating a regional action plan with both mitigation and adaptation strategies, and convening annual summits so we can see where we are, how is it going, all of that. The structure involves a lot of staff people who are doing most of the heavy lifting, or almost all the heavy lifting. And Nicole has that name of Nicole Hefty because she's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And there are 2 members of the staff steering committee, 2 members from each county, a municipal representative from each county. And I didn't recognize Richard Cooper. He's also here from the Miami-Dade League of Cities. The League of Cities is very important in this effort, and all the leagues of cities in all the counties. In part because I think, unfortunately, the Miami-Dade County Commission is really not waking up. The staff is doing great work, but some of that exists in parallel to what's going on at the commission level. They have part-time administrative and technical support people, there are staff technical support teams. So there are people doing lots of research and making lots of plans, but I'm really concerned about the part that it's not reaching the county commission level in the way that I think it should. Things are going forward. The commission did agree on the plan, but I'm not sure that they really know what it all means. So, turn it over to you.
I'm going to be bolder than that, mostly because I don't have an aspiration to run for office. And I'm also not a policy advocate either. At the event 2 months ago, Mayor Bauer was there, and I asked her if the city had conducted a vulnerability assessment for Miami Beach and sea level rise from an economic perspective. And the answer that I got back in a room of 70 people was, my constituents haven't asked me for it yet. Well, when you do ask for it, and if you don't ask for it soon, it won't matter what that assessment is, because there won't be enough money around and there won't be enough time around. So one of the things that really needs to come out of this is absolutely the coalition of engagement, and we've got to change the will to address this issue. This is a risk management issue, and when we look at the probability modeling, if they say 6 inches to 6 feet, you don't look at it and say, well, we'll just deal with 6 inches and then hope that 6 feet doesn't come. It's not how you run your businesses. It's not how we run our national security community. This is not risk management. It's not the basic minimum. It is an equation of figuring out what we can tolerate versus what we cannot, and what we're willing to spend to ensure that we don't incur what we cannot tolerate. It's worth noting that there are really some extraordinary efforts starting to come off the ground in different parts of the country and also at a national level. And I do want to bring some context to that, because while the compact is leading the way as far as multi-county, multiple counties who are linked together addressing this as a geographic region, there are some really interesting and noteworthy efforts, and I want you to know that you're not alone in addressing this issue. The city of Chicago, prior to Rahm Emanuel taking office as mayor, began conducting an adaptation plan that had community stakeholders from major industry players to NGOs to the academic institutions and to regional entities going as far out as South Bend, Indiana, involved in that. The San Diego Bay Foundation funded a research project for several years ago, about 5 years ago, on San Diego's risks to sea level rise, which are very different than the ones that we face here, and concluded that they had really substantial risks. And consequently, the municipalities in that surrounding area are working with the city and the utility and major corporate stakeholders, as well as the San Diego Foundation, to begin their adaptation planning efforts. New York City, obviously, has been hit by 2 major storms, Sandy being the most prominent and recognizable over the last 3-4 years, and Mayor Bloomberg has put considerable resources behind this and is looking at this from a preparedness perspective as well as a long-term perspective. Boston has a Green Ribbon Commission that is shifting its focus from the footprint of the city to the fact that the Boston Harbor will start inundating areas, and hospitals in that area have already started removing critical infrastructure from the ground floor to the top floor so that when they are inundated, they will not be compromised. And lastly, federal agencies, under the executive order that the president issued to all federal agencies in 2009, 13514, which requires all agencies to undertake a really robust set of sustainability initiatives, are required to develop adaptation plans, all of which have been were posted for public comment earlier this year. And those adaptation plans, of course, account for The federal government is the largest land manager and owner in the country at nearly a third of U.S. land. It has significant climate change related and sea level rise related risks. And there's some great work being done there. On the flip side, I will very quickly, in closing, mention that the state of North Carolina, in its great wisdom, and its legislature decided that it was going to attempt to regulate Mother Nature such that sea level would not rise more than 8 inches. Now, I don't know what sort of stick they are planning to use to impose penalties upon Mother Nature when she should decide that she is going to exceed 8 inches. But that is not the approach that one should be taken. That's the head in the sand approach.
So I want to get Katie to kind of talk about in a minute about the primary goals and the elements of the action plan, but I want to get Esther in on this a little bit. And the Dutch, it seems like you're doing everything right there, and that may not be the case. There may be some criticisms there, but I'm curious about is you have centuries of experience of this in your country. Even with all that and everything that you have in place, are there still political forces and give and takes when it comes to this kind of water management that as a country you have to overcome? Obviously, we're in the embryonic stages of it here in the United States in dealing with this issue, but is this like an ongoing, I don't want to say the word struggle, or fight, but it might be a fight when dealing with water?
Well, basically, in the 1950s, we had a terrible flood that, unfortunately, more than 1,800 people lost their lives there. We had significant collateral damage. And after that, people said, never again. And politicians decided to start with a Delta program, a Delta plan, where they would lay out what needed to be done to prevent this from happening again. And that's where all the hard structures came from. So the storm surge barrier, et cetera, et cetera. Katrina was actually a wake-up call for us as well, and that people said, wait a second, do we know what is in our dikes? Do we know, are we well prepared? How about spatial planning? Are we doing the right things there, yes or no? And it was decided that there would be another Delta commission that would take a look at these things. Now, in that is basically what you've been saying as well. We have all the disciplines represented and all the stakeholders there as well. So we have the academic institutions, we have the politicians, well actually no, I should rephrase that. We have the government in there, not the politicians on purpose. We have private sector in there, and they have a separate fund. And that cannot be touched upon by politics.
We've heard of those funds in the United States.
Yeah.
It's not always worked that way.
So that is something that they on purpose, because there is changes in government as well, and they know that this needs a long-term approach. So they know, okay, we have to secure this amount of money per year, and we have to have a specific group of people that will take a look at the different areas that need to be touched upon.
Well, I don't know, Katie, you've been in government, if we ever get one of those funds that politicians can't touch, but putting that aside for a moment, let's look at some of the positives, and obviously this climate pact is one of them. What are some of the goals with it, and as far as the action plan to maybe put some of this into place?
Well, I'll be happy to talk about some of the positives, but I do have to say about this idea of setting aside funds. Tommy Strowd couldn't say this because he works for the South Florida Water Management District, but that budget has been decimated. I mean, when you think about a state that has to deal with water issues and the staff has just been wiped out. I mean, Tommy's still there. We're very glad he is. He's very knowledgeable, but many of the great professionals in the Water Management District are just gone. And if there's ever a time when we need to be dealing with water and looking at the future and our engineering capacity and our pumping capacity and all of that, this is the time. And so that is, to me, just a total lack of vision on the governor's part and the state of Florida's part. Now, the goals of the plan for the Climate Change Action Plan that the 4 counties have agreed upon are, and these are just some of them, but achieving emissions reductions, because again, it's not just about hardening our system and figuring out the water and all of that. We have to be thinking long-term as well. Achieving emissions reductions and health benefits, advancing new and alternative fuels, the fact that we don't have a real solar initiative in the Sunshine State, again, is just absurd. Fostering a green economy, improving public transportation and community livability, and a little plug for a program that I'm having next week on Wednesday is Can We Conquer Congestion? And that's going to be about transportation and livability, and that's going to be at Northern Trust Bank next week. Goodgov.net, if you're interested in attending, we still have some spaces available. Protecting infrastructure and the environment, building and ensuring long-term resilience plans and economic vitality of the region. And I think resilience is a really important word because, again, that's the optimistic part. We can come back from this. We can plan for this, and we can be resilient. It just takes imagination and planning, and it does take money. It's going to be expensive, and so that's part of it. There are 110 recommendations that are considered actionable, doable deeds within 7 sections of this plan. They include sustainable communities and transportation, water supply management and infrastructure, natural systems, agriculture, energy and fuel, risk reduction and emergency management, certainly critical issues, and outreach and public policy. And I think the outreach and public policy part of it are so important because without the community being aware and being invested in the solutions, it's going to be very difficult to do all of this. And that's why I think the more we have forums like these, the more we have the community getting educated about these issues, then there starts to be a buzz created, and then the whole thing can go viral, and we can really learn about it and convince our elected officials. I'm going to talk more about engaging your elected officials, but those are some of the main points of the Climate Action Plan.
Okay, Dan,
If I may, I mentioned earlier the idea of conducting an assessment of the economic implications. You can't justify an investment if you don't know what the cost of inaction is. And we need to put some context to this, right? So, look, we're spending billions upon billions of dollars for infrastructure projects every day around the country. You can look at the stimulus bill, the ARA bill from several years ago. And we want to inject money into the economy, so we immediately go to paving roads. And I'm oversimplifying this. But at the same time, every one of these projects, every time we make an investment in infrastructure and built environment, if we're not looking at this from a multi-decadal perspective, here's what we are doing. We're coming back in 5 years and we're putting bad money on top of bad money on top of bad money. This is not an environmental issue in this context. This is absolutely, first and foremost, an economic issue. So the question here is, you're taxpayers. You want to keep spending bad money on top of bad money and then be affected in your quality of life and your businesses? Or do you want to start making sounder investments that are going to enable you to thrive and enjoy more successful lives in your businesses and personal lives?
All right, well, let's talk about, further implementing the plan as well. And of course, I'd like to involve Wayne in this part of the conversation as well because...
Finally, a question for the lawyer.
Hey, you got full applause as an attorney. I never saw my parents get that.
That is true. I don't know if I've ever seen that either. But certainly, as far as implementing all of this, I mean, there's a political side to it because we need the politicians to actually implement the plan. We need the government to do that. But wrapped up in all that too are, legal and environmental issues and concerns and costs and how all that's going to be done. So when we look at the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, let's talk about, implementation, the best way to go about that, and maybe what some of those challenges, could be also from a legal perspective.
Well, I think from a legal perspective, it is not really the current status of our legal system in any way that has an impact. What has to start is, you have to start at our local level and look at it from a micro perspective. The city of Miami Beach is an island, and it will be severely impacted by climate change. Whether it's water coming from the west, water coming from the east, or water just rising up from the bottom because we're a man-made island. And we do have apathy in our community here. We don't have the kind of attention that should be paid to climate. And when you talk about the type of legal issues, one of the things that needs to be changed or looked at will be our building codes and how things should be built in the future. And when do you start that? When do you start making those changes? The city of Miami Beach is undertaking one of the largest projects in its history, the new convention center and the surrounding area. Are they looking at that from perspective of what climate change might have or what impact it might have on that project as far as its infrastructure. Another thing that you have to look at, and again, it's not really a legal issue, but it'll present legal problems, and that is that I think before the tide issues become really impactful to our community, what you'll see is insurance rates starting to affect our economics. Our economics will be affected by insurance companies who will raise rates. Insurance companies are the largest lenders in the world, not banks. And if they're not writing policies for development and for people to be able to buy homes or sell businesses, you'll have significant economic impact. And laws will change as a result of that. For instance, at the city of Miami Beach recently, I was talking to the planning directors mentioning that, as seawalls start to crumble in your backyard, because of just regular maintenance, they should now have ordinances that should be passed that says if you're going to rebuild your seawall, it should be built at a new and higher level to combat sea level rise in the future, and that at some time in the future, maybe by 2025, 2028, that all seawalls in the city should be at a certain height. So laws will change, but only if it's stimulated from the micro sense that the community, the city, has to get involved, and the city government, its elected officials and administrators have to start imposing, new laws, better codes, and probably should create a task force, because today, as you see, and Katie went around the room and asked who was here, from the city of Miami Beach, there are some administrators, but only one elected official is here, and that's Jerry Libbin, when all of them should have been here, because this is something that they need to hear in order to protect this community. And I was advised by Professor Gonzalez a couple months ago about a study that was done that talked about which city is going to be the most impacted by a rising tide. And the number one city in the world was Miami. So if Miami's number one city in the world, we must be something right next to that being Miami Beach, and we're an island. And yet, we really haven't undertaken making any changes in the law. I'm trying to spearhead that with Aaron Tandy and the Chamber's efforts to try to see some change, some gradual change. But I think that change has to start now. Some of the information that was given today was, forecasting over the next 75 or 100 years that we might have, 2, 3, 4, 5 foot level sea rise. But the truth is, no one really knows how high it's going to be. They just know it's coming. And the sooner you plan, the sooner we change laws, the better we will be, and the sustainability that we hope to have will hopefully be there.
Katie? Did you want? I don't know if there's anything you want to add as far as implementation and the best way going forward. Maybe even talking about engaging, the private sector, communities, to get involved further.
Well, again, I think so much of it is awareness and building, and a lot of the recommendations in the plan build upon recommendations that enhance resiliency to severe weather through hazard mitigation planning, economic vitality, the efficient movement of people and cars, and people and goods, and we're doing a lot of that. Addressing issues that have priority and allocation in our current budget, including responses to natural disasters, mitigating flooding issues, curtailing the threat of saltwater intrusion. All those things are real factors that have to be addressed, and they're all expensive. Now, the county is now embarked upon a public works project of about $4.5 billion to deal with some of the sewer, water and sewer projects, but that's not enough. We really have $12 billion of needs, and that's before even sea level rise is factored in. And so there's a lot of catch-up work to do at the county before we even address the issue of sea level rise and factoring that in. So again, it's people knowing who their elected officials are, talking to their elected officials. Wayne's disappointed that there aren't more Miami Beach commissioners here. I'm delighted to see that Jerry is here. I also mentioned Richard Cooper, who was with the League of Cities, and the League of Cities, I think, can be very instrumental in making sure that this becomes a priority in this county. The county commission is not going to do it, the League of Cities can do it, and we have 35 municipalities in Miami-Dade. There are about 36 in Palm Beach County, and about the same number in Broward. So there are lots of municipal officials who can be leaders in this effort, and it's a wide open opportunity. If people aren't picking up the slack, it's a wide opportunity to be a leader on this issue. And that's what I think is really needed.
All right, just Dan, I'll get to you in just a second. I want to ask Esther, though, obviously, the Dutch, I mean, how have they gone about as far as like engaging the community, the private sector, to have them involved, you know, as far as, you know, water planning is how I like to put it, you know, just not solely relying on government. Obviously, it has to be a partnership.
Yeah, well, basically, the Delta Plan Convention, you had all the different stakeholders in there. There's also some initiatives like, for instance, we have an organization called Deltaris. And this is a research organization that actually has the private sector, the public sector, and the academic institutions in there. And they work together. But also, we start, you know, in the elementary school already. There are several programs that are run in the Netherlands at schools, so they are educated on this. Plus, there are several places, for instance, the storm surge area that I showed you has a museum where they educate people on, okay, what's going on with sea level rise, what do we have to do, et cetera, et cetera. And these kinds of initiatives are everywhere in the country, so people are exposed to it a lot, and also the media is a very important outlet, so to say, or advocate for this matter.
Dan, did you have some more comments as far as community outreach, education?
Two quick ones. One, building on Wayne's comment about the convention center. Who here knows when this building was built? 50s? It was long around when I was born in 76. So 60-year plus investment, and we're looking at another convention center. That's an economic engine for the city. If and I'm not involved with that, if that is not projecting out, and that whole surrounding community is not projecting out for what it's going to have to deal with around it, you're going to build another convention center in 20 years? I would ask that question. Secondly, elected officials need to get engaged on this, but elected officials tend to reflect the people who are pushing their buttons. If you push their buttons and make this a priority for them, it will be a priority for them. This is no different than civil rights in the 60s. It's no different than gay rights currently. If it is number 1 on the agenda or number 2 on the agenda, it will be addressed. If it's number 20 on the agenda, guess what? It will only get addressed when there's nothing better to do.
Well, we have a room today full of a lot of business leaders, and this is, after all, the Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce. So let's take a look at maybe now what the opportunities are for the private sector, for the business community when adapting to sea level rise. Esther, do you have a perspective on, say, the Dutch, some of the private sector benefits that's come out of these efforts, and maybe how they've seen benefits, you know, from what the Dutch have engaged in?
Well, of course, there's engineering companies, et cetera, and the consultants that have benefited from this because they get contracts from it. So that's one thing. But also by showing that you are being innovative and taking certain initiatives definitely has a benefit as well. There's companies that will constantly tell people, hey, we did this to make sure that we're prepared for the future. The Port of Rotterdam, with their project there, which was very sustainable and is ready for sea level rise, they even have tours there now to show people what they've done. So little things like that, there's always certain opportunities that present themselves.
Right, and it's also, it's long-term economic viability. I mean,
Absolutely.
you know, whatever the government and the private sector is doing, whether it's your individual business or, you know, the community as a whole. Katie?
Well, I think that's where the chamber could be really helpful as far as the marketing and PR of this goes, because I don't think the government will ever spend enough money on public relations and marketing on any initiative. And so the chamber and the private sector can be really helpful in that area. And then there's going to be plenty of money available just at the county level with the billions of dollars that are going to be needed for all the infrastructure plans that are in place. So there's going to be lots of work for engineering firms and for people with innovative ways of making sure that we are resilient and that we do adapt. But we really need the private sector for a lot of the educational part of it and the marketing and PR. And I think that that could be a great community service. And Dan is really right about pushing the buttons of elected officials in order to get them to move. I think there are elected officials who understand these issues and who are willing to take leadership, but it's going to take a push from the citizens so that things actually happen. And the more we educate ourselves, the more that can happen.
Did you have anything about public-private partnerships, Dan, that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I mean, this is infrastructure projects or jobs. I mean, the stimulus, we go pave roads, okay? Well, let's go invest in our infrastructure and create jobs, except let's not invest in stupid infrastructure projects. Let's invest in infrastructure projects that will be around for more than 5 minutes or a half an hour. These are great opportunities. Not only are they jobs, and by the way, I think that I had a conversation with the head of the Hines Center up in DC, which is a think tank that is very interested in looking at a carbon tax. And I said, don't look at it as a carbon tax, look at it as a jobs bill. Go tax carbon and put every dollar that comes into the carbon into investing in infrastructure projects, and it's not a carbon tax, it's a jobs bill. And that's really the conversation here. And then for those who invest in Miami Beach, and by the way, one of the challenges we have here is a lot of the money and the ownership here isn't here. So they don't get to see the footage of water sitting on the beach like we do. In that context, we got to encourage them to invest in these projects. These are money makers for them. Big dollars are spent here from people who never set foot in this land. We've got to find a way to get them to put their dollars in here in a way that really helps us build this community long term.
And Wayne, might give you a chance to make a couple of comments here, and then in a few minutes we're going to open it up to audience questions.
Well, I think from an economic perspective, you start with the planning, the engineering, and then the construction, and there'll be plenty of that. I know looking around the room that there are some contractors in here who do a lot of work in the city and have recently finished roadway projects, but a lot of the projects that we have, or that we should have going forward, need to be redesigned. Roadways need to be elevated, homes will need to be elevated. Things with regards to seawalls will have to change. And that will create a lot of jobs and a lot of economic stimulus. I also see people here that serve on a number of our community boards that are involved with planning or design and review. And those boards need to start taking consideration, what projects are coming before them and how they should be built so they have sustainability and so they last more than 5 or 10 or 15 years. Recently there was a project on Miami Beach and the contractor did a really great job in a residential neighborhood putting in new sewers and drainage. But the city didn't have the budget to raise the outfalls. And so therefore, you now have a great sewer system, but when the tides rise again, you're going to have pushback because they didn't do the outfalls at the same time they did the sewer. And the city really should have grasped that and done a good job. And those kinds of things create jobs, but they also create the opportunity to save money in the future and not have to go back and do it again. Many of you may know that Alton Road is going through construction, and that's a Department of Transportation project. So the city really doesn't have a lot of input, but the city has tried to ask the department to put in more pumps, especially because that's the area that floods the most. And they rejected that, and they're only putting in 3 pumps when they probably need 6 or 7. So we do need to do things, and they will create jobs, but there are probably people who would do that kind of stuff, and if we plan correctly, that creates sustainability, it creates the opportunity to have more jobs, and it creates the opportunity to have better construction so it lasts and have longevity.
Esther is shaking her head at us over here. How could we not get this stuff all together? We're catching up to you, don't worry, okay. Let's see, let's open it up to questions, and then kind of at the end I'll give everybody a chance to maybe make like a closing comment or so. Who has questions for our panelists? Yes, sir.
Yes, over the past 10 years, if you know, in Miami Beach, what percentage of the flooding was due to knee tide, and what percentage was due to torrential downpour?
Okay.
Repeat the question.
Right, the question was, in the last 10 years on Miami Beach, what percentage of flooding was resulting from deep tide as opposed to torrential downpour? And I feel like we ought to pump this back out to Tommy, but
Good fun.
But mostly because in the last 10 years, at least for me, I spent only 2.5 of the last 10 years here on Miami Beach. I was in DC for a big chunk of that.
Well,
Okay, John.
Yeah.
John Van Leer from the University of Miami. The 28th of October this last year, when Sandy was passing offshore, we had a counterclockwise circulation around Sandy, which bucked out some of the clockwise circulation in the North Atlantic, and we got a slowdown in the Gulf Stream by almost exactly half. And it turns out that sea level in the Bahamas is 3 feet higher than it is in South Florida, and that difference is sustained by the flow of the Gulf Stream. And so if you slow the Gulf Stream down by half of that 3 feet roughly comes to Miami. And if the Gulf Stream were to stop altogether, we would have 3 feet additional sea level rise in Miami. And so it's not just king tides. You know, this is another one to add to Englanders' list of sea level rise, king tides, the Gulf Stream flowing down. And so these are things that contribute to the apparent sea level rise and the flooding of Lincoln Road, which was, I was here during that time protesting, trying to get a question about sea level rise in the presidential debate.
Well, and I think the main thing is that the tides come on a regular basis. The tides are always going to come. Obviously, rainfall flooding, fluctuates, over a larger time span, depending on what kind of climate cycle we may or may not be in. So, the tides are going to keep coming. There's not going to be any change to that. Yes. Somebody else had their hand up over here. Yes, sir.
Dave Van Geloven, the University of Miami. Yeah, on the one hand, we can see the clear need for education, to educate the public and to educate our children about sea level rise and the need for action. But on the other hand, if we look farther into the future, we can foresee a time when increased consciousness morphs into panic, and you get a mass exodus out of the community, or the community stops growing. And so the question is, how do you navigate between those two extreme points of view?
I'm just going to suggest, because there's a point where in the Netherlands, where once the sea level gets to a certain point, there isn't a resilience conversation. And I think we ought to start, because they're 50, 60 years ahead of us on tackling this issue, on how they're starting to address it before we bring it here.
Thank you.
Sorry, Esther, I'm throwing you under the bus, but...
Use the microphone so we can hear the thing.
But go ahead and answer the question, Esther.
That is a good question, and that is something that you have to find the right balance. And I think that in educating people, you will have to find that balance by deciding what will you tell now and what will you tell tomorrow, and basically slowly, go up in that. But that's just what I would say. I'm not sure if that's the...
Well, I would say if you do enough planning and implementation, you don't ever have to get to the point of panicking. Because you've taken care of the problem. I mean, we have really brilliant engineers, and necessity is the mother of invention in this country. It always has been. So we can do a lot if we plan for it and if we make the proper investments. In Venice, people just kind of abandoned first stories and they just live above them, and the population is decreasing. There's no question about that. And in the end, Wayne alluded to this, maybe the insurance companies will decide whether or not we're going to live here because they just won't insure things anymore. But in the meantime, there's an awful lot we can do with the right engineering solutions. Florida was a swamp. Remember, with much more primitive engineering solutions, we created this community. We can adapt and we can be resilient. It's just going to take a lot of imagination, a lot of hard work, and a lot of money.
And getting to the panic, I want to bring up New Orleans as an example. A place I was at for a decade before I was here in Miami. The city of New Orleans has lost 20% of its population because of Katrina. That's a panic. And the long-term strategies that were put in place there weren't adequate. Partially it was human error as well, but they also weren't adequate, and you ended up with a massive engineering failure. And as a result, post-Katrina, you also still don't have the right political decisions being made as far as rebuilding, and putting that city back together. So I think, sir, that's kind of, looking ahead, that's a small microcosm of the kind of things, we could face if we don't plan in increments and do it gradually and get ourselves in a place to where there won't be that kind of panic.
I'd like to just quickly chime in. There's no silver bullet. There's not going to be a silver bullet. If you looked at John's presentation, we know how high sea level is going to get at some point down the road. We don't know whether that's thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. Okay, Here's what we fundamentally know. Over the last 6,000 years, which is just about the written record of man, and John, I'm basically stealing your thunder here, and you should read John's book if you want to get the full picture of this, and much more accurately than I'm going to depict. But shorelines haven't changed, sea levels really haven't changed in 6,000 years, and that's basically what we know. And here's the game changer. The game changer is the environment is changing around us. And what we're going to fundamentally have to do, and we can either stick our heads in the sand and pretend like it's not, or we start to figure out how we thrive as a species with an environment that is fundamentally changing around us and could be changing at a very rapid pace starting as early as next century. And that's just a reality we have to face. That's not to say we should be going around saying the sky is falling, but there's an interim and there's a long term, and in some parts of the country, the long term is, I'm sorry, you saw the maps of what Florida looks like. In 200 years, South Florida doesn't look like a great place to go, although it looks like a great place to canoe.
Yes, ma'am.
You partially addressed this earlier. On Alton Road, all the construction, you're saying there's not enough pumps going in. How about the rest of the construction in the city of Miami Beach? Throughout Mid-Beach, there's construction going on like crazy on all the streets. Is any of that construction addressing any of these environmental issues? We've got flooding on Royal Palm, let alone North Bay. So I just want to know if anything that's being done has those things in mind right now.
I can't comment specifically as to what each roadway project is doing. Many of them are needed because the pipes that we have throughout the city were built in the 40s, so they're being replaced. As far as dealing with flooding, there's probably not too much that's being done. The city is under a situation where they don't have the funds to put in the pumps. Fred Beckman, who was a former public works director, was quoted as saying that the city currently has, I think it's about 15 pumps, and within 4 or 5 years, it should have about 40 to 50 pumps. And that's not happening. We're not installing the pumps. They haven't selected the areas where they should go. And it's something that is needed in the future. So to deal with the flooding, and as was said earlier, most of our drainage is done by gravity, but we know that's not sustainable. We know that's not going to continue, that we have to add these pumps, which will also push the water out. But before you can push the water out, and we do have some engineers here in the room, that you have to raise the outfall so the water doesn't come back in. So I would say that in that area, there are things that are being done that will help flooding. That's the idea of the drainage that they're putting in. But overall, we're probably going to be without the kind of pumps and the kind of systems that we need over the next 10 or 15 years.
And Rick Salter is here from City of Miami Beach. So Rick, would you just comment, because you probably are the person who's closest to it right now.
Rick Salter, I'm the city engineer for City of Miami Beach. Just specifically answer your question about the work going on in the Bayshore neighborhood. The city's installing 5 pump stations up there, and they do meet the criteria of the new stormwater master plan, so they have accounted for sea level rise. And they're being, we're injecting the water into the aquifer. So that's a 20-year plan. So for the next 20 years, we should be getting a 5-year, 1-day level of service. About the life cycle of the pump station.
Okay, I had, let's see, yes, sir, you had a brief comment about something.
Yeah, we have been living in a carbon-based economy. There is tremendous money to be made in converting to a renewable economy. I'm making 7% on my solar panels, being paid to me by FPL. There is a different way to live. And I can't believe that the state of Florida hasn't embraced the solar industry, as Katie so eloquently suggested. I mean, there's no reason why we can't have hundreds of thousands of solar workers in the state of Florida making money and keeping it in our local economy rather than shipping it halfway around the world to people that produce oil. The time has come. I can't believe we're even discussing the Keystone Pipeline permit. That is the most insane project that you can imagine. 200 additional parts per million in the atmosphere on top of the 400 we already have there. Are we nuts?
I'm going to oversimplify in response. Stop voting Republican or Democrat and start asking these questions. Because honestly, if you blindly go and say, I'm going to vote my R or vote my D, and you put people in office who aren't even, they're just not willing to address this, frankly, period. In Florida, it's a real problem. You've got a governor whose first step was, I'm going to shut anything environmental down in my state agencies. I'm going to consolidate and get rid of 2/3 of the people who do this work. You have this choice. Put people in office who are going to address this, And I'm not saying go get somebody who's gonna get a carbon tax or cap and trade bill. I'm saying put people in office who will at least ask the right questions and get the right research done, the right research and development, and put in sound, sensible policy that weighs risks and opportunities.
Okay. Let's see, yes, sir.
The stormwater master plan in Miami Beach wasn't being implemented, does meet the criteria the commission voted for. But the parameters were set at an inappropriate level, a wrong level, and they have not accounted for high tides in October and November.
Okay. I don't know if anybody here can address that specifically, but.
I think that's Nicole.
Well, I was just going to actually ask Rick.
Come on, Rick. New panel.
No, I don't know if Eric is here, Eric Carpenter, but Rick, maybe you could talk about how because he mentioned this to me at a meeting we were at, how you're designing the pump wells, looking further out, and it's really a great example of some adaptation planning and some incremental planning that I think would be a good example for folks to hear. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. We don't know what sea level will be 20 years from now. As we saw in the presentation today, there's a range, and we picked a number that very well might be wrong. We're going to be monitoring it and making adjustments as needed. But one thing that we've done is we've looked out 20 years, and that's what we're trying to project to, because our pump stations right now are lasting maybe 10 years in this marine environment, maybe a little less. We're hoping with some of the new materials we're using, we might get 20 years out of our pump stations. But 20 years from now, we're going to have to go in and replace things. So what we're doing, some of the longer lasting infrastructure, we're sizing so that it'll last longer, like the concrete boxes in which we place these pump stations. We're making them a little extra large because we know someday we're going to have to go put larger pumps in. So those are some of the types of things that we're doing to try to be adaptable and flexible, given so many uncertainties.
And just to point out that something Dan was saying is that now they don't have to go back and totally redo that pump well,
right,
because they've already designed it larger so that it's, they're able to adapt to larger pumps. So I mean, that I think is a perfect example of the types of things that we need to be thinking about.
It's adaptive planning.
Right.
Okay, Jerry, did you have a?
Yeah, I just want to ask perhaps before you wrap up, a rhetorical question, but I want to put it in your mind. And the question is, what are each of you, first of all, thanks for being here, but what are each of you going to do after today to educate people and to make action plans as a result of what you're learning? Stay engaged. There are going to be more water forums, not only from the chamber, but around the county and multiple counties. I challenge you to stay engaged, to get educated. You heard, and it's so true, that if it's 20th or 15th on the legislative agenda of commissions or at the state or national level, you saw that the federal government can't even agree on a budget. We have a sequester. We've got elderly in our community that are not being fed as a result of inactivity because government can't come to decisions on difficult tasks of how to spend resources. So I invite you to stay engaged. I urge you to stay engaged. I will be leading a trip, if you're interested, to the Netherlands this summer. Come firsthand, see what's going on. Come back with ideas, be invigorated. So again, thank you all. Thanks for the panel, and appreciate all of your support today.
Okay, I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. Yes.
Hi, Sherry Roberts. I just want to thank you, Katie, because you have been a leader for years.
Can't hear you.
I just want to thank you, Katie. You've been a leader in this area for years while you were on the county commission. And you've been beating people up, and they're finally starting to hear you. So thank you very much.
I just have a question, because a lot of seems to be bashing Tallahassee, bashing Florida, especially after the last session. With this being primarily the four counties' problem, is there enough initiative, do you think, for these four counties to separate from the rest of the state? Since politically we have always been that way. I'm a native of Miami. I know it's out of the box, but is this a big enough problem? You know, added to what happened with the Dolphin Stadium, taking our election away from us, things like that, where maybe it's time that we just separate, and this issue, especially after looking at that map, where that map doesn't really affect the rest of Florida. It really affects these four counties. Like
I'm going to chime in and say that I swore I would never be part of a Rick Perry secession speech, but all right, look, Southeast Florida is not the only part of Florida that's impacted by this. I have news for you. The entire Gulf Coast is equally as impacted, and maybe even more. Well, let's not go more so. Let's just say they're equally as impacted. The Tampa Bay area counties are starting to want to coalesce around this, and there's an effort to convene their own compact, as well as Southwest Florida. I had a conversation with some folks yesterday that are looking to do it in Southwest, and I think Nicole would tell you that there are numerous counties, particularly coastal areas around the state, that have been begging and chomping at the bit to get involved with the Southeast Florida Climate Compact and to support it. Local government folks absolutely are getting this issue, particularly in coastal areas. So this is not just a Southeast Florida issue.
No, and there's another plan called 750 that's a regional plan with 7 counties to look at economic prosperity for the future, and a lot of that involves the issue of climate change and sea level rise. But I also want to suggest something else to you. How many of you are fans of term limits? Okay. All right, well, consider this, that when you vote for term limits and you have commissioners or elected officials who are term limited, why should they think about 50 years from now? Why should they think beyond 8 years from now? Why should they think about 10 years from now? They just need to get reelected one cycle. That's it. So if you want to think about, have people represent you who think about the long term and who think about the future and posterity, you need to have people in office who are in it for the long haul. And sometimes that has costs associated with it, but sometimes you get public servants who really care about the big picture and the long haul. And so next time, you know, it's important to connect some of these dots. And you need people who are in it for the future.
All right, well, I'd like to give the panel a big round of applause. Thank you for your contribution. I want Tandy to come up for some closing remarks, and I'd just like to thank the Chamber and everyone for having me here today. CBS 4 was glad to be a part of this, and I'm going to go back to the station and track this golf disturbance now, which has nothing to do with sea level rise, but I'll let you know at 5 what happened. Aaron.
Rick's going to make one. Look, if you're interested in this issue, one of the things that I've done is I've brought a national program that's a 3-day event in 2 weeks in Fort Lauderdale called the Rising Seas Summit Down here. Tommy will be speaking at it. Most of the number of the folks that are here today will be speaking at it. But we're also bringing in the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We will have the Dutch and British consuls general. We have federal agency officials. We have local government folks from Boston, New York, Seattle coming in. We have industry experts from all around the country, national organizations, different perspectives that will benefit this community. Come, and if you can't come for the 3 days, come take the 3-hour primer workshop that John Englander and Hal Wamless are going to teach on Sea Level 101 on Tuesday, June 18th. You can look it up at risingseassummit.org.
So first I want to thank David Bernard for moderating our panel and keeping us on topic. I want to thank not only today's participants who sat on the panel, but the distinguished scientists, government and community leaders who took the time to come and are in attendance. I want to thank my co-chairs, Sherry Roberts and Wayne Pathman, as well as commend the hard work of the Chamber staff, Sandy Aronson, and Ceci Velasco, our COO. While today's forum is only the first in what we hope will be a series of informative discussions, we want you to understand that this is a top priority for the Chamber. I think that no one is planning to move from the state of Florida simply because of this panel's discussion, or this event today, or the other events that are around. We expect to be here for a long time. The Chamber expects this community to thrive, and we think that there are ways that we can do that. But we also recognize as Chamber leaders that what we need to do is invest the time and efforts today so that we can see those dividends in the future. I think you heard today that these problems are identifiable. But the fact of the matter is, solutions are also identifiable. We just need to have the political and regional will. To be honest, the business community also needs to have the will to find those solutions. So the challenge I leave you on behalf of my co-chairs in the chamber is this. You need to, as Jerry said, continue this dialogue by engaging more people in this conversation, and you need to draw upon those of us in the community who are knowledgeable about these issues and who are taking a leadership role in finding practical solutions that will benefit our area and individual property owners, because those are the people who are going to be affected by this problem first. Towards that end, I hope you can stay after, so people are going to stay to continue the dialogue for a couple of minutes. And I hope again that you will join us in the fall when we continue the dialogue. Thank you very much for your attendance and your attention.